Welcome to this Travel Weekly Roadmap to Recovery webcast. I'm Ian Taylor. Today we're going to talk about COVID testing and travel, and I'm joined by Claire Irvin, Head of Travel at the Telegraph, Luke Petherbridge, Director of Public Affairs at Abta, and Duncan Alexander, Travel Industry Consultant. Welcome all of you. Claire, the Telegraph launched its Test for Travel campaign last week. What's that about? Why has the Telegraph seen the need to launch its own campaign for testing?
Well, I'll answer the second question first, if that's okay, in terms of timing. So we have, throughout lockdown, had, I suppose, various different phased approaches to how we meet our readers' needs. And several months ago, we decided to kind of pivot the team and launch a daily live news blog, which is rolling news and really kind of addressing the ever-changing situation in travel. Now, that has done really well with our readers, and we've had a fantastic response to that. It's grown in terms of readership and engagement and might, I suppose. And, you know, we've had quite, even with a team our size, we've had quite a job in terms of responding to the news agenda and trying to drive that news agenda. You know, it's been a pretty full-time job. And of course, you know, quarantine has been massively unpopular through the summer, but literally just commenting on that and trying to get the message across to government about how unpopular and how damaging that is, not only with our readers' confidence in travel, but with the industry itself, has taken everything we've got. But it was just, and I think with campaigns, it's all about timing. Of course, there was a Safe Travel campaign which launched halfway through the summer, you know, and we, you know, we've done what we can to support that as, you know, as a consumer publication. I think it's suddenly, you know, and as I've just said, timing is everything with a campaign. And it suddenly felt to me a couple of weeks ago, with the end of peak season approaching, with quarantines even more chaotic than ever, and instead of, as we'd hoped, petering out, seeming to ramp up again, that we needed to really you know, we needed to act while our readers were as fully engaged as they possibly could be, with the risk of kids not being able to go back to school because of quarantine, and you know, we all know the ins and outs so well. And you know, it just felt the right time. So we have been pushing the government throughout to look at testing, as you know, has everyone here. And it just felt the right time to consolidate that into a very strong message that actually, you know, this situation was not going to be getting any better. It's only going to get worse, and the government really needed to act. But it was also very crucial to act at a time when the consumer's opinion was fully with that, and because, you know, for whatever reason, and I don't know why, the government is not listening to the travel industry. And, you know, all that great, hopefully Safe Travel will have some effect and has had some effect on that. But they still weren't doing an immediate about turn. So it was time, I felt, for us to look at exactly what you know, we knew from our readers' responses that they were fed up with quarantine, that they were happy to test. So we did two things. We polled our own readers officially to get some statistics behind that. But we also got together with AudienceNet, who have a much wider demographic than, I mean, Telegraph readers, as you know, hugely prolific travellers and spend a lot on travel. So they're an important consumer to the travel industry. But what we felt was most important to the government in terms of getting their attention was having as wide a possible demographic as we could behind those results. We chose to show both those results separately so that our readers continue to feel a sense of ownership of those, but also so that, you know, they could see that what they were thinking was a reflection of non-Telegraph readers. So we went live last Wednesday, and wow, what a week! You know, in terms of escalation of that campaign, both internally at the Telegraph, excuse me, and elsewhere. You know, we've had an absolutely enormous groundswell of support from the general public, from MPs, from industry beyond the travel industry. You know, our business desk is as committed to this campaign as we are, and wow, you know, I think we've really managed to make some noise. And as I say, it's not a different campaign to the one that the industry is running. That's the industry voice. You know, as a consumer publication, it's very important that we stay true to our roots, and with all the interests of the industry at heart as well, we did that in a way that reflected the general public, our readers, and actual travellers.
Okay. It's not a different campaign to the industry one. That's important to stress, because we want to widen this out from the just Telegraph readers, although it's obviously been very good for the Telegraph. That's clear from what you're saying. Can we come to the question of polling and what that suggests, and also to whether the government's listening to the industry? You said it's not listening to the industry in a minute. But first, Duncan, can I just ask you've had some involvement with the Test for Travel campaign. What exactly are you proposing? How do you see testing working in relaxing the restrictions?
Yeah, hi Ian. I'm laughing because it's typical. The postman just arrived and the dogs are going mad over here, so I'm trying to keep them quiet. The joys of being on Zoom. I think before we get on to that, I think something Claire said about, you know, why isn't the government listening? You know, let's just talk about the macro issues here. So if we go to the World Travel and Tourism Council, you know, they've consistently stated for a number of years that travel is about 10.3 is the last number, percent of world GDP. It's a significant number. Now that's in the region of, you know, 9 trillion. Now for the UK, I think the number's about 9. It's about 9% of GDP, $200 billion worth of business. Yeah, that has been more than cut in half. All right, 4 million jobs. Now, when furlough stops, is that going to be 1-2 million people unemployed? So back to Claire's point, I don't understand why government has not been listening. I mean, this is a really material problem. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Let's get to that in a second about whether the government's listening. But let's assume that everyone listening to this webcast agrees that they want the travel restrictions relaxed. How would testing do that?
Well, very straightforward, really. I mean, if you think about, you know, how does this thing get transmitted at speed? Yeah, it gets transmitted at speed in locations where people are congested together, and there's respiratory sort of movement between people. Yeah, so that's how it's transmitted. So if you're getting people through into a country, you have to start putting defensive perimeters or protocols in place. So what a number of countries started to do, I think one of the counts I saw was about 25 to 30, was saying, let's test people when they arrive, let's screen people. And there was one particular flight about 8 weeks ago from Bangladesh into Rome. They tested everybody as they came off the plane. 22 people out of 220 were infected, and they caught that. Yeah. So when the government throw out a number like, oh, we'll only catch 7% of the people, I don't understand who's advising them on that sort of number. So the first point is that is a point of defence, is to test them there. Now, you then get the argument that government's put forward is that you get this incubation period. So it could be 3 to 4 days, 5 days until someone's showing the symptoms or has incubated enough to shed enough to infect somebody else. And therefore, if you've tested them at that point in time, you might not pick that up and you might create a false sense of security. So that's been the public statements that the government literally up until yesterday were saying, so therefore the argument then to counter that is test on arrival and test a few days later from a high-risk country. Yeah, so that's where the industry is saying is just create this defensive mechanism of screening on arrival and then test again a few days later from high-risk destinations. That way, we might be able to start a more sustained opening of routes versus well, let's start again. No, we have to stop oh no, we have to stop in 24 hours. And we saw the disruption and chaos that that's caused.
Okay. The 7% figure, just for clarity, comes from a Public Health England study, modelling, basically. And it's just, there's a 0.07 probability, as in 0.07 out of 1, that somebody infected in the previous 24 hours would not show positive in a COVID test on arrival. So that's where that figure comes from. Luke, can I come to you? The government's not listening. Is that right? You've been talking to the government consistently through the last few months, haven't you?
Well, I think it's more accurate to say the government hasn't yet acted on some of this stuff. I mean, there have been working groups going on within the Department for Transport looking at testing for a number of months with the aviation sector, led by the aviation sector. And beyond that, we're having pretty regular dialogue across the sort of 5 asks that we have. So it's not just around testing and quarantine, but also the financial support. I think it's more fair to say there hasn't been yet any action on those issues. Having said that, of course, if we go back to the beginning of summer, we're in a very different place on quarantine than where we are now. So there has been some movement as well. And, you know, we were one of the supporters of the furlough scheme initially. So that was started. There was the retail and hospitality and leisure grants that benefited travel agents at the beginning of the crisis as well. So, you know, there has been some stuff from government already. Clearly, we want more. And we're working with people on the call, but also the other trade bodies in the Safe Future Travel Coalition to try and deliver a concerted lobbying campaign between now and the budget.
Okay, I want to ask you about the Safe Future Travel Coalition in a second, but just the government is not ideologically opposed to air travel, is it, or to international travel? Quite the opposite. So why has the government dragged its feet on this, do you think?
I mean, I agree that they're not, you know, fundamentally opposed to international travel. I think that it does go back to a degree to the consumer kind of perception of travel, which has shifted, and I think that's an important part of why the government's own positioning might begin to move, as well as some of the priorities that they've been focused on around schools and the like coming to fruition, which allows them to have a bit more capacity to deal with some of the longer term kind of economic issues around trying to restart the whole of the UK economy. And I think that's an important one, has been that the government, certainly over the last few weeks, has been very heavily focused on schools, you know, rightly so, getting schools back successfully, and now can move on to some of these wider issues. I'm not sure, as I say, I'm not sure that it's fair to say that nothing has happened from the government. You know, there have been unprecedented levels of support with the furlough scheme and with retail grant schemes and the like. I think it's just that we need more now, and I do think actually as you move into the autumn, they are more likely to take a tailored approach to industries that have been, you know, slower to restart or facing a more prolonged recovery, as the travel sector clearly is.
Okay, and just on the Safe Future Travel Coalition, there's a series of asks involved in that. Testing is just one of them. And talking to you previously, I mean, you've suggested that Abta sees regionalised corridors and regionalised Foreign Office advice as more important really than testing. Just explain how you see it.
Yeah, so we have 5 asks, 2 that I would characterise as policy and regulatory change. So yes, the regionalisation of quarantine policy, which we'd like to see. The second is, of course, testing. And we have been supportive of the introduction of testing as a way to reopen an increasing number of destinations around the world and important trading markets for the UK. And then the 3 financial asks are a holiday for air passenger duty to try and incentivise people back into the air in the same way that Eat Out to help out, of course, incentivise people back to restaurants. The targeted support for small and medium-sized businesses in particular, so things like the retail grants that I referenced, but also extension of other business support measures such as business rates relief and VAT deferrals into next year, in recognition that actually, given the summer we've just had, the financial recovery isn't coming from many businesses until 2021, so those measures will be needed to be extended to next year to help many businesses through. And then, of course, ongoing salary support. We know the furlough scheme is ending at the end of October. Government has been very clear about that, but there are a number of sectors, it's not just travel, where the economy isn't in a position to support the jobs. And Duncan was referencing this earlier. And if we, you know, want to retain those jobs, which was the government and Rishi Sunak's priority back in March, then an extension to salary support in some way, which may not look like the current furlough scheme, is going to be necessary. We have used the Australian JobKeeper scheme as an example that the UK government might wish to look to. That is a scheme that's been extended to the end of March 2021, so is roughly on the same timescales as where we think the critical kind of recovery or first recovery period is for travel agents and tour operators and many within the industry. But crucially, it also allows people to work whilst they are receiving that support, which of course has been an important ask for the travel industry. And is equally, it is also means tested. So it is far less costly than the current regime. It is based on the recovery of revenues that individual businesses are going through. Just to go back to the balance, and I think that's what it is. I think it's a balance between testing and regionalisation of quarantine. We need both. But I think the industry needs to ensure that in the call for testing, we're not losing sight of the importance of regionalising the quarantine policy, because the current sort of whole country blanket approach is unsustainable. And frankly, if we're ever going to open destinations like the United States back for the UK, which is a hugely important part of our aviation connectivity and aviation market, of course, then a regional approach is clearly very, very important too.
Okay. Duncan talked about 2 tests, Claire, one on arrival, one a few days later. Is that essentially what the Telegraph is asking for, or are you not going into the specifics of what's required?
No, that's what we're asking for. So what we wanted to do was give the government take away any suggestion of having to think things through, just give them the solution that their voters are asking for. So it was very clear that not only are the people we polled in favour of testing, but they're really happy to pay for it too, up to a certain amount. Now we've suggested, as you know, as we all have, various ways of funding this, but that seems to be very clear that people are so in favour of this that they will put their own money behind it. Now, our campaign, you know, having spoken at length with Duncan before, and obviously other experts on the actual tests themselves, before we launched this campaign and throughout the summer, there are obviously, testing on arrival is the quickest way of implementing some form of testing, and it does still require this second test and a shorter quarantine. So yes, we are saying that as a first step, that's what we want the government to consider. But there is also, and Duncan will is far more able to talk at length about this than I, but the idea of testing on departure and multilateral agreements between nations and across borders to enable COVID-free corridors so that people really, really can travel in confidence. And we have urged them to look at that, but that is obviously a much longer term ask. Yeah. It is going to involve, you know, a huge amount of discussions between nations, and you know, so we think, you know, that is the ultimate aim that we'd have. But initially, you know, we having spoken to many people very well placed to advise on this, that testing on arrival would enable a very full implementation of international travel in the next weeks and months, and as our editorial line says on the campaign, in time for Christmas. Okay, so
just on the specific, that there'd still then be quarantine for perhaps 8 or 10 days, whatever it is.
5 days.
So 5 days, so a test after 5 days and instant release if it's negative?
Yeah, so people, obviously, if they test positive on arrival at the airport, then they go into quarantine. But if they, after the 5 days, if they test negative still, then, you know, they're seen as able to go.
But even Germany doesn't have that instant. So Germany had testing on arrival and dropped it last week because it was overwhelming the testing facilities, and so now has 14-day quarantine with a test after 5 days, and if that's negative, people are released from quarantine restrictions subsequently. So you think that's too restrictive?
But we're talking about tests that And again, Duncan has one of these, as Travel Safe, these labs in a box tests that enable you to be tested without all the administration around sending your test off, waiting for results to come back, and so on. So you know, it is doable, and you know, to reference your comment at the start, you know, people are desperate to travel. The government has underestimated how important holidays and international travel, where our families are concerned, and jobs are to people. And we've seen over the summer that people, you know, are desperate to travel, but they really want to travel safely. And, you know, the lack of consistency over the quarantine policy and the chaos around the quarantine policy itself isn't just undermining travellers and passengers' confidence in travel itself. It's undermining their understanding of what is safe. And we need to find a solution that not only enables people to travel safely, but that is easy enough to understand that they are travelling in the safest possible way.
Okay.
All of that mitigated by the disclaimer that we are still in a pandemic, and, you know, there is going to be an extra element of risk with travel. But I think if you can define and contain those risks in a way that's really easy to understand, it will make travel much more palatable to those who want to do it responsibly.
Duncan, I'm sure you want to tell me about the lab in the box. So please do. But just before you do that, you and Claire are suggesting test on arrival, and most of the discussion is about test on arrival. But IATA wants to see test before departure, doesn't want test on arrival. And the airports, with the exception of Heathrow, which is doing tests on arrival, or wants to do a test on arrival trial with the services firm Collinson and with Swissport, the ground handler, that's to open travel to the New York, to the US. The airports generally don't want testing at airports because they fear they haven't got the room for it. So why are you arguing for test on arrival when most of the aviation sector isn't in favour of that?
Well, there's a number of points there. I mean, for a start, airports do have the room, and you can distribute the testing before departure. I think they have less room actually to test on arrival, but I'm not going to get into the ergonomics of an airport. The concept about testing on departure relates back to what Claire was just saying, which is duty of care. Right? We today send advanced security information to nation states through agreements with advanced passenger information. We today search people at a border before they get onto an airplane. Yeah, we don't ask them, did they carry a bomb on board when they get to your country? So testing on departure is actually, I was going about security parameters earlier about testing on arrival and 5 days later, but if you test at the destination, the source market's border, you're not letting it into the airport, you're not letting it onto the plane, you're not letting it into the country. You're then not trying to chase down 20 kids who've been to Zante and find out where they've been for the last week, which happened at Cardiff, and happened at Plymouth, and happened at my local school nearby where my wife's a teacher. Yeah. You put the perimeter at the logical place, which is, you know, where it comes in.
So just to clarify then, you test on departure would be better. That's what you're arguing for now, but the Telegraph complaint is about test on arrival, isn't it?
Well, no. Well, to Claire's point, Claire's saying, what's the quickest to implement to ease the issue and the impasse that's going around with regarding quarantine? That is to do something locally, which is test on arrival and 5 days later. But when you see 3 different houses in this country, you know, the Welsh, the Scots and the English can't even agree on the quarantine regime and timing of it, so Claire's point is to get 197 member states of ICAO to agree to something versus let's do something now. That's Claire's point, yeah?
Right, okay.
The logic going forward, the logic that should have been deployed at the start of the pandemic, now I'm speaking as a personal individual here, is if a pandemic's declared by WHO, nobody should get into an airport unless they've been tested negative. Because if we look going forward, if you look at OEG statistics, seat capacity has been cut in half. They're saying this month 15 million more seats will come out of the system. Yep. So there's going to be roughly between now and Christmas 40 million seats a week available. Let's say load factors are 20, half that, 20 million people. 20 million people are getting into airports untested. So, I mean, why bother locking down economies when you've got that many people? Now, the point about regional, you can see the stats start locking a particular area down is absolutely right. So if you've got a location that's going up, you ask the state to test people before they get into the airport. Or if they don't, we test them on arrival and 5 days later. It's a really simple concept of creating green zones, green corridors, where you deploy your testing protocol depending on risk assessment. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what Travel Safe Systems, a company I know. I've been helping them out in because one of the gentlemen there's a long-term standing friend of mine. They've come up with a solution that is, and I'll come back to the stats about the 7%, which is, it's called LAMP technology. It's more accurate than what most people use, which is PCR. PCR, my understanding, was withdrawn from Germany because they're running out of capacity and reagents. That's a bit serious, that. This box enables you to take a swab, throat swab today, hopefully saliva in the future, put it into the box, get a result in 40 minutes. With PCR, you need labs, specialist environments, you need to send it away. You can get sample spoiling in that process. It's quite a complicated test versus LAMP, which has been around for 20 years, but it's a similar molecular test. It's just done in a box and a much shorter time scale at an economically viable price.
What's the price?
It was around 38, 40 pounds for a test, which ties into Claire's survey that she was saying that people would be prepared to pay up to 50 pounds for a test. That was the results that they showed. Yeah. It is viable. An airport and an airline could invest. The government could take away departure tax, as Luke said, to ease the burden. But if you take a scenario, Ian, there was a news article over the weekend about Ischgl being one of the hotbeds of COVID. Yeah. So if the Austrians want a ski season, yeah, our outbound market's massive for them. So if we tested on departure and they tested in resort 5 days later, and they tested on departure and sent people back, that 3 tests in 7 days with a 5-day incubation period before you come in infected could start to corral and contain this and create the defensive measures. Because this test, if you caught the virus yesterday, we'll pick it up tomorrow, which is more accurate than PCR. That's a fundamental difference. There's a magic 3-day window where you can be tested, and if you're negative, you're not going to infect somebody for 3 days.
Okay, we don't want to get too deep into the specifics, I guess, but just to be clear, the cost would be multiplied by the number of tests, obviously. So the cost of a more than one test is always going to be more than £50. So I wonder who would pay the cost, and maybe I'll ask all three of you that. But also, Duncan, how quickly could this speedier test or speedier testing be rolled out? Because at the moment this isn't generically available, is it? So if we're talking about a short-term solution, is a lab in the box a short-term solution?
No, it's an immediate solution. I mean, the company that have this solution, and there's a couple of others that are investigating LAMP technology, it's a molecular test. It's similar to PCR. It's just far more robust for the sort of field environment like at an airport. Yeah.
But so could these be, in every UK airport by tomorrow? These lab in a boxes?
It would practically, it would take a month to get one airport going with about being able to handle 35,000 passengers a day. But if you ramp up the production and the manufacturing, which is doable, you could have every airport equipped out by Christmas.
Right. Okay. That's what I wanted to know. And who, Luke, if testing was rolled out, who would pay for it? Who does Abta or the coalition think should pay for the testing? The consumer, the industry, the government, a combination?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've not, to be completely honest with you, and we've not gone into that level of detail. You know, as a coalition and as Abta ourselves, we have taken the view that we are not, you know, medical experts, we are not scientists, we are not in the position to dictate what is the appropriate testing model for the United Kingdom. What we have said is we clearly need testing as an additional mitigation measure in order to reopen important international markets and in order to get the travel industry back on a path to recovery. And it is for the government to work out exactly how they want to do that, whether that be 2 tests, 1 test, and who pays. You know, I mean, in most countries that have introduced testing regimes, Austria, I know, has one in place. It is the consumer who pays for that, and there has been, I think Claire was saying earlier, you know, there has been some willingness to do that. Most consumers are willing to pay. Of course, the price point then becomes important as well. What is that price point? And, you know, £60 is very different to £120. We don't know exactly what the cost of testing might be. Yes, Claire, yeah.
When the poll that we did UK wide said that so the majority would pay up to so there was, I think, 46% worth £50 and under. There was another 19% who said they'd pay up to £100, and then a further 20% said £150. So whilst £150 is by no means the whole of the UK population, you know, looking on an industry basis, even if that 20% were the only ones who could get travelling for the next 3 or 4 months, that's certainly more than are travelling now. And, you know, we felt that was still very important. Yes, of course, we want to go for the most affordable option. And yes, of course, we'd like to see as little as possible, you know, being shouldered by the consumer. But in terms of giving the government solutions, you know, that is still, that's still 20% of what we haven't got at the moment.
Yeah, I want to ask you and qualify that a bit, Claire, if I may, because that was the Twitter poll with Telegraph readers. You're talking about the results there. The survey you did with AudienceNet of the general public found 52% were prepared to pay a minimum of £50. Yeah. And of those 52%, 38% would pay up to £50, 10% would pay up to 104%, up to 150. So 14% of the 52% would pay more than £50. So only 7% of the general public would pay more than £50, which doesn't sound an overwhelming endorsement for consumers paying for the tests, unless they're under £50.
I disagree, actually. I think, you know, we have Telegraph travel. So that's the general public. If you look at Telegraph readers who are, as I've said, prolific travellers and, you know, are at the top end of the spend in terms of the travel industry, it's you know, it's a strong indication that there would be support to pay for it. And, you know, if there are so many other solutions being bandied about, including APD, you know, if you're to see holiday costs come down, assuming that ended up with the consumer, and then a test being put on the cost of a holiday, you know, I think that's very much, it's a less bold statement than would you just hand over £50. You know, the tests we're talking about that Duncan's just gone into much more detail about are around £40 to the consumer. And, you know, I think both those polls show an indication of willingness to pay for that.
Okay. The government, obviously, members of the government read the Telegraph. I can confidently say that, but there is other polling going on, and it's worth just noting this because I want to ask whether the industry is in step with public opinion or risks being out of step with it. So a YouGov poll of almost 2,000 adults on August the 20th asked, do you think the 14-day isolation period for travellers arriving in the UK should be shortened? 14% said it should be shortened, 68% said it should be as it is, and 6% wanted it extended. So 74% thought it should be a minimum 14 days. On September the 4th, YouGov asked 3,700 UK adults, how sympathetic are you, if at all, towards UK holidaymakers abroad who have to pay to return to get home sooner than they planned because the country's been added to the quarantine list? 68% said not sympathetic. 7% were very sympathetic, 70% fairly sympathetic. So the reason I'm quoting that is because the public polling seems to fairly consistently suggest that a majority of people are in favour of the quarantine restrictions and so on, unfortunately. So I wonder, Luke, can I ask you this? Does the industry risk being perceived as putting its economic interests ahead of public health?
I think it's important the industry avoids being seen for that. But I think those stats you just read out, Ian, I think what's important there is this is all about risk mitigation ultimately. And what the consumers are not being, what people are not being told about there, the general public are not being told about, is the steps that the industry would be putting in place to mitigate the risk. So that is why we're talking about testing. That is why we're talking about regionalising quarantine. You know, I don't think anyone's talking about just, you know, complete free-for-all of travel here. This is all about risk mitigation. So I think as long as that's where the industry's message remains, then actually, you know, we can take the consumers with us on this journey. I do think we need to be careful not to get, you know, not to be seen to be speaking fully in the interest of the industry and not taking account the wider public health message. Of course, right now the priority, we are in the midst of a pandemic, needs to be public health, but ultimately we're all talking here today about how we mitigate that risk in order to restart travel and help the UK economy. And that's ultimately in the public's interest as well. You know, we are a trading nation by nature, the United Kingdom, and the economy needs to be restarted at some point. I think there is recognition for that in the wider public as well. So it's how do we work together to mitigate that risk in the most effective way, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Good. Sorry, Claire.
Our job is to understand our readers and you know, to be able to be their voice, ask questions they want asking, and you know, etc., etc. And the, you know, the response we've had since the beginning of lockdown. I mean, you know, we published a feature saying, when can I next go on holiday, 3 weeks into lockdown, and that's consistently been one of our best performing features ever since. So this is not to you know, I see our job as responding to that whilst making sure our readers are as informed as possible about the risks as well as about the policies that are being implemented in their name. Now, you know, since we've launched this campaign, we've had all comments open, and the travel feature has remained open. It hasn't remained behind a paywall. And we have published, obviously they are published by their very nature as comments, but we have published features around those because such has been the response. And yes, we've had people who completely disagree with the whole premise of travelling in a pandemic and you know, want us to know very, very forcefully their feelings. But equally, you know, the majority are in support of this. And I think, of course, we stand by the YouGov, you know, we would take that into consideration. But as well, you know, sometimes these questions without context around them are very hard for general public to understand when they've just been surrounded by confusion and chaos. So I think it's important for us anyway to listen to our readers, but also listen to the response that we've had. And also, you know, the rush to get to destinations the minute that they are given an air corridor. So, you know, you can only take all of that together and decide on a response. And I think what's very important is that none of us are talking about travelling without, you know, concern for ours and other people's health and safety. I mean, we're not. We're talking about travelling safely. But
okay, yeah, that's clear, of course. Duncan, same question to you, perhaps. I can guess what the answer is, but I wanted to ask more specifically. In a piece for the Telegraph by Nigel Trim, who's the co-chief executive of Travel Safe, the lab in the box makers, he explains how the thing works and so on, and there'd be this digital certification, so not a paper certificate, so it's not open to people trying to cheat the system and blah blah blah. But then in the piece he said the travel experience in the airport and on the plane would be more comfortable, and there'd be no requirement for masks or social distancing. as well as quarantine on arrival. Now, that goes beyond what ICAO and EASA and IATA and all the governments are saying, which is that masks on aircraft and so on are going to be required. I saw the IATA chief medical advisor last week say masks will remain until there's no mass community transmission in aircraft. So why say something that flies against what everyone else is saying if we're accusing the government of confusing messages and a lack of clarity?
I think it's a very simple answer to that, is that Nigel and the guys in that company have developed something in pretty breakneck speed. Yeah, so the 7th of July, they received the CEIVD certification for quality for Europe. So this test is pretty new. Yeah, LAMPA's technology isn't, but specifically for COVID and picking up COVID, it's fairly new, 7th of July. It was immediately deployed in Lampedusa, which is an island between Tunisia and Sicily, where 5,000 migrants had turned up during July, and was field tested literally on the quayside. So you can imagine that was some test, yeah. But this available technology is yet to really be, I think, understood by the people who have the duty of care that have to provide that, which is ICAO, IATA, the airlines, the airports. Yeah, I think once they understand that there's something that can pick it up with the specificity and the accuracy that this has, that if you were infected yesterday, it will tell you you've got it tomorrow. When they understand the process of then the 4 to 5 day incubation period it takes to build enough viral shedding to then be infectious, that's when they'll start to realise that actually this could be the thing that unlocks aviation. It comes in a suitcase. This thing literally you could plug it into a car cigarette lighter, but it could be the trigger and that enables sustainability. Because what you've just proven, and yeah, of course, there's always going to be maybe a bad swab or something that comes through, but you've said that person's not infectious. You can then enter a safe zone, be that a school, a theatre, a care home, a hospital, an aircraft. Yeah, knowing the people around you aren't infectious at that time, and that's the key here. And as the evidence builds, that what I'm saying is a fact that it enables that level of identification. That's a big change. And
okay,
get that result in 40 minutes and put it out digitally, and then use that in the boarding systems and the gate systems at airports is really key. So just as a defensive mechanism for inbound, as Claire's advocating right now, this is something that should be seriously considered by government. And
right.
We've had some very good support from ministers as well. And I think that groundswell is happening literally in the last week or so to really take a serious look at some alternatives that are available now.
Okay, to each of you then, perhaps Luke first. How important is the debate in Parliament on Thursday about aviation and about tourism and COVID, and how hopeful are you of seeing a significant government announcement in the next few days? Luke?
I think Parliament being back and being able to make the noise and show the government the sort of depth of support for getting travel restarted and supporting the industry through financial measures as well is really important. And I think having those debates on Thursday, as you said, one on aviation followed by one on tourism and COVID, is very important that the industry engages with those. And we've encouraged people through Travel Weekly today, but elsewhere as well, to contact their member of Parliament and to ensure that they are speaking up for the sector and, for travel agents and tour operators and all the businesses that are out there that really need travel to be restarted in a more comprehensive way than what we have currently. I think it's the first kind of opportunity to do that. As I said earlier, we've got the budget coming up probably in November, not yet confirmed, but likely to be early in November, and we really need to be making a push ahead of that, which is likely to be the next time when the government really announces the next set of comprehensive kind of economic support package for the whole of the UK. I think it is important that we engage and make our voices heard at that time.
Okay, Claire, the Telegraph is clearly pretty well wired into the government. It's been the best informed of the daily newspapers on what's going on behind the scenes on quarantine and so on. How hopeful are you of an announcement imminently or within a few days anyway?
I haven't, if you're asking have I got any intel, I don't have any at all about what's going to happen, but I am more optimistic in terms of the direct support that we have for specific solutions to the predicament we find ourselves in travel. I am more optimistic than I have been since the travel industry closed down, that we will see something workable, and something way more workable than quarantine.
Okay, Duncan, how hopefully is it realistic to think there'll be a testing regime in place in time, say for the October half-term holiday?
No, because the track record's been too much pontification, if I'm rather blunt. But it could be. I don't see any reason why someone like TUI or Jet2 could not start to offer COVID-free flights, no matter what the government says. There's no reason. They could take this test, they could test people on departure or on arrival, either way, and they could start this under their own steam. Airports could collaborate together, they could invest together. I think if you sit and wait and wait and wait, as we've done so far, we stand a real threat of huge collapse in this sector. And if I owned an airline, I would start to take matters into my own hand. Yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the big destinations like Dubai, they want to see that you've had a test before you enter, and they test you a few days later if they're worried about where you've come from. It's not difficult to understand. I don't understand why it's so difficult to understand. It's not difficult to understand. If they don't get progress soon from the government, and the indications are there may be some relaxation, if I owned a cruise line, I would take duty of care and test everybody before they went on that boat, and 5 days later. If I owned an airline, why wouldn't I do the same?
Okay, that sounds like a perfect place to stop. Thank you, Claire, Duncan, Luke. You've been a great panelist. Thank you very much.